Hi and welcome to this course. My name is Maximilian Schwarzmuller. I'm your instructor in this course and I will teach you React Native from the ground up, step by step, in great detail by building many apps to dive into the different core features you must know and to make sure that you thoroughly understand all these core features and that you can practice working with them. Now, this course requires React knowledge because React Native builds up on that. I did create React the Complete Guide, which is a great course you can take as a prerequisite for this course if you don't have this knowledge yet, but of course any prior React knowledge will do. In this course, you're then going to learn React Native from the ground up, as I mentioned, and of course you will get all the theory you need, but also all the practical examples you also need to understand that theory. And therefore, I would say let's not waste any time, let's dive right into this course and let's start with the most important question first. What exactly is React Native?
So, what exactly is React Native? Well, as the name implies, it is related to React.js. And with React.js and React Native, you can build real React Native-based mobile apps for iOS and Android, which are real apps you can distribute through the app stores and apps that can be used by any user with an iOS or Android device. Now, React.js is a library that's independent from React Native, though. React.js is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And it is typically used for web development. That's also the environment for which it was first created. But actually, if you worked with React.js, you might know that it's actually another library, the React DOM library, that adds the actual web support. Because React itself, the library React itself without React DOM, is platform agnostic. Which means you can use React in conjunction with React DOM to build web apps, but React, the library itself, actually does not care about the underlying platform. React just gives you tools for managing state, for building virtual component trees, and then you need an extra library like React DOM for translating the result React produced to an actual platform like the browser. Now, React Native is basically an alternative to React DOM, therefore. React Native gives you a collection of special React components which you can use in your JSX code. So React Native ships with built-in components you can use. And those components are then compiled to native UI elements for the iOS and Android platforms. And React Native will also take care about this compilation step. In addition, React Native also exposes certain native platform APIs, like using the device camera, so that you can use such features in your JavaScript code, even though you need to tap into native device APIs for that. And therefore, in the end, React Native is like React DOM, it just does not target the web, the browser, as a platform, but instead iOS and Android. And React Native gives you all the components and the APIs you need to interact with those platforms and to build apps for those platforms. That is what React Native is all about. And therefore, in order to work with React Native, you also must know React.js, because you will write your code in React.js and then just use these extra React Native components and APIs in your React JavaScript code to produce those native mobile apps for iOS and Android. Now, how does React Native work under the hood, though? If you're building a React and React Native app, then you're typically writing code like this, which should look very familiar if you worked with React.js before, maybe or most likely for building browser-based apps. This is a React component, what you see here. And it's just one way of writing such a component. We could also use the function keyword instead of defining an arrow function, and we could also use a class-based component. But it's code like this which you will write for React Native, and it's code like this that will be compiled to real native app code, so which will be bundled into a real native app in the end. Now, if you take a closer look at the code snippet on the left here, you will see two components, two JSX elements in there, which you don't know from web development: the view and the text element. These are some of these special components that are exposed by React Native, which will be compiled by React Native. It is worth noting, though, that it's really just the views, just this JSX code that is compiled, not the JavaScript logic itself. I will come back to that in a second. So the components, the JSX elements you use, are compiled to native elements for the respective platforms. And to make this a bit easier to understand, take a look at this comparison table here. Here we got a bunch of elements as we would use them in the browser if we would be using React DOM, and then the equivalents for the native platforms, and then the components exposed by React Native to target those equivalents. So for example, if you want to display an input element where users can enter some text, then when building a web app, we would use the HTML input element, which is available in JSX when we're using React DOM. If we would be building a native Android app with Java or Kotlin, then it would be the built-in added text widget that is provided by Android, which we need to build. For iOS, it would be the UI text field element. And with React Native, we would use the built-in text input component, which is provided by React Native and which will then be compiled to edit text for Android or to UI text field for iOS. So React Native maps and compiles reusable components like text input or view or many other components about which you will learn throughout the course to their respective platform equivalents. That's one of the main jobs React Native will take care of. But what about the logic? I mentioned that those views, the JSX elements, are compiled to their native equivalents. But what about the JavaScript code you write outside of JSX? What about all these functions, if statements, state management? What about that? Well, unlike the UI elements, the logic is not compiled. The UI elements, which are those components exposed by React Native, are compiled as you learned. But the logic which you write in JavaScript is actually not compiled, but instead it's running on a JavaScript thread that's hosted by React Native in the native app that was built. So React Native basically spins up a simple JavaScript process as part of your native app that's being built, and it manages this process for you, and it allows this process to talk to the underlying native platform. And therefore, your JavaScript code will run as JavaScript in the native app that's being built, but it will then talk to the underlying Android or iOS platform through a basic translation bridge, you could say, that is provided by React Native as part of your native app. That's how you can think about this. And that is it for now. That's how React Native works under the hood and what it does for you. You don't need to know more. You can, of course, dive into the official docs if you do want to learn more, but that is what you should know in order to work with React Native, because I believe it's always important to have a basic understanding of how a tool works, and this is how React Native works. So I would say it's enough for the theory for now. Let's get started. And for that, you can simply search for React Native to find reactnative.dev, which is the official React Native website. Now on this site, you can learn more about React Native. And it is a great additional resource if you do want to dive deeper and learn more about it. But of course, you will learn all the essentials and everything you need to know to build React Native apps in this course. Now, in here, on this site, it is a good idea to click on Get Started though, because there you'll learn how you can create a React Native project. And what you will learn here is that if you do click on Environment Setup here, on setting up the development environment, that you got two choices. That you can use a tool called Expo CLI, which seems to be recommended because it's the by default selected choice, and that you can use the React Native CLI. Now, as I just said, Expo CLI is selected by default, and indeed it is my recommendation as well, and it is the tool we will use in this course. But you could also use this alternative approach. Both approaches will give you a development environment in which you can build React Native apps. So what's the difference then? We have the Expo CLI and the React Native CLI. CLI stands for Command Line Interface, and both tools are tools that exist in order to help you create React Native projects and run React Native apps on testing devices and simulators, as well as build React Native apps so that you can ship them to the app stores. So these are the tools you need to really build apps and to get those packages, those distributable packages, which you can upload to the app stores. These two tools are crucial. But you don't need to use them both. You can use either of the two, and one tool is enough. But why do we have these two tools, and what's the difference? Well, the Expo CLI, or just Expo, as I will also call it throughout the course, and the company behind this CLI is in the end a third-party service that you can use. A service that is entirely free. You don't have to sign up, you don't have to pay for it. You can sign up and you can pay. They do offer extra paid services, but to build React Native apps and to ship them, you don't need to pay. When using Expo, the CLI, and a couple of other free tools which they give you, you get a managed app development workflow, as I like to call it. Which means creating projects is easy, writing code is a bit easier, tapping into native device functionalities like using the device camera and so on is easier. And in general, when using Expo, the Expo CLI, and also a couple of other tools provided by Expo, writing native apps with React Native is more convenient than with just the React Native CLI and without Expo. There is less friction to this process. And the best thing is that you can still leave this Expo approach and ecosystem anytime if you need to. If you start by using Expo because it's easier to get started with that, and then at a later point you find out that you want to switch to just using the React Native CLI workflow and not using Expo, you can do this anytime. That's why it's also the default selection to start with Expo, because it's easier and you can still switch anytime you want to. Now, why do we have the React Native CLI then? Well, because it existed before we had Expo, because this is the tool provided by the React Native team and the community around React Native. It gives you a bare bone React Native development setup, which means you will need to do more configuration and setup work on your own. There are less convenience features, and if you need to tap into certain native device features like using the camera or other features, then it is often a bit more work when not having Expo around. Because as mentioned before, Expo is not just about the tool that creates projects, it will also give you helpful packages and tools that you can use when writing code that will make your life easier in that case as well. Now, what the pure React Native workflow does have, though, is that it is often a bit easier to integrate with native source code, so with source code written in Java or Objective-C or Swift or Kotlin. So if you must mix JavaScript code and native device source code, then using just the React Native CLI could be beneficial. But the idea behind React Native is that you don't have to do this too often, and therefore this might not really be an advantage. And for all these reasons, and especially since you can switch anytime if you need to, we will use Expo in this course. As you will see, it's super easy to get started with that, and it will make building React Native apps much easier. So therefore, back here on the official React Native website, we will stick to this Expo CLI quick start approach here. And we need to run this command in order to install the Expo CLI, which is the tool that will then allow us to create Expo-based React Native projects. Now, we do install this tool with npm, which is the Node Package Manager, and therefore you need to install Node.js. Now, we don't need to install Node.js because we will write any Node.js code, but simply because we need to install this package, and also because Node will be used by some packages under the hood. Hence, you should visit nodejs.org and make sure that you download the LTS version from there, which in my case is version 16, but simply download whatever the LTS version is for you when you're viewing this. So I will download this and simply walk through the installer. And there is an installer for both Windows, macOS, and also for Linux, so you can and should install this on whatever device you're on. And once you do have Node.js installed, you're ready to run this command in your terminal or command prompt. So here I'm in my terminal, and in there, I'll just paste in this command, and I'm on macOS where I must add a sudo in front of this command in order to make it work. You might not need to do this. You definitely don't need to add this on Windows because this is not a Windows command. On Windows, you just execute npm install -g expo-cli. But on macOS and Linux, you might need to add this, especially if you're getting some permissions error otherwise. So with that, I will install this by also entering my password here, and this will now download and install this Expo CLI tool globally, that's what -g does, on my system here. So I will be back once this finished. So here it finished for me. You can ignore any warnings you might have gotten here. It did finish successfully if you can run the expo command thereafter and you don't get an error when trying to do this. Now this, by the way, shows you all the commands you can then execute with expo. There are a lot, and the official expo documentation is the place to go if you want to learn more about that. You do find that documentation on expo.dev, but we don't need to take a closer look at those commands right now because there's only one command we need to run right now, and that is expo init, which initializes a new project. But since I'm already on this official website, as always, you might want to explore those docs in addition to this course. Simply because in there you can learn more about Expo, the philosophy behind Expo, how you could switch to a React Native only project, though we will take a look at this later in the course as well, and how you can use it. So this is a great backup resource in addition to this course. Now here we did now install Expo. Now we can create a new project by running expo init. For this, I switched to another folder here on my system, the folder where I want to create this new project. I switched to it here in the terminal with the cd command, which you can also use on Windows in the command prompt to switch folders and paths. And then in the place where I want to create my new project folder, I will run expo init, and then I'll name my project rn course here. So this will be the name of the folder which will be created and the default name of the app that will be created in that project folder. So if we now hit enter, we get a little menu here where we can choose which kind of project we want to create. The options and the text here could change over time. Right now, I can choose a blank project with TypeScript support, a project that already has navigation added to it, which we will take a look at later in the course, or a bare workflow project, which is actually a project that doesn't use too much Expo, but again, we will take a look at that later in the course. Right now, we want to have such a managed workflow project where we fully embrace Expo and take advantage of it. And I don't want to use TypeScript. I also don't want to use navigation right now. We will add it later. Hence, I'll just use blank here. And this will now create a new blank Expo React Native project in a folder named RN Course, since that is the name I chose here. Now this did now create this project folder, and it shows us some commands we could execute in there to start the Expo development server, which will basically watch our code and create a development app bundle whenever we change the code. And we can then also run that code in preview mode on iOS and Android. And even for the web, though that's not the focus of this course, if you want to build React web apps, then my React Complete Guide is the best choice. Here we'll focus on Android and iOS. Nonetheless, I'll not execute those commands right now. Instead, I want to open this new project first so that we can see what was created in greater detail. So we created this project, this Expo project. Before we run it now, I want to open the created project in an editor that allows me to edit the code in a convenient way. Now you can use any code editor you want. My recommendation is Visual Studio Code, which is an amazing free code editor that's very extensible and fun to use. You can download it for all platforms, and I already do have installed it for macOS. Now with VS Code installed, you can open it, and you might see a welcome screen if you installed it for the first time. You can simply close that screen, and then you should see something like this, where you can open a new folder. Alternatively, you can always go to the menu, File, and find Open on Windows or Open Folder on macOS there. And then if you click that, it will open such a file picker where you can now select that project folder you just created. So here I'm selecting this RN course folder, which I created before, and I'll open this in VS Code. So here I got this Expo React Native project opened up, and you can of course configure the visuals, the way VS Code looks, however you want. By going to View, Appearance, you can hide or show the sidebars, the status bar at the bottom, and you can also go to Preferences and then choose a color theme that suits your needs. I'm using the Dark Plus theme here. So you can configure this editor however you want. But what was created for us here? Well, we see actually not too much. We got two folders, Expo Shared and VS Code, which we can ignore. VS Code just holds some settings I configured for this workspace here, and Expo Shared simply just holds some internally used information. The assets folder will become important later because we can store images there, for example, the icon of our app, but also images which we use inside our app. And we got the Node Modules folder, which holds all the third-party packages that are used under the hood. We got a package.json file, which lists all the dependencies of our project here. And here, for example, we see Expo, because Expo is not just the command line interface, it's also a JavaScript package which we can use and which we will use heavily, as you see, because it gives us many utility functionalities that make writing React Native code easier. But you also see we're using React, React DOM, React Native, and React Native Web, though again, that's not the focus of this course. You could build web apps with React Native, but support is a bit clunky, and yeah, we're simply not focusing on that because you could just use React itself if you want to do that together with React DOM. React DOM, of course, therefore is also just here because of React Native Web. So that's what we have here. We also got a couple of script commands which we could execute with npm. But overall, there's nothing fancy in here, and you know these kinds of files if you worked with React before, which you should have because this course assumes that you have React and JavaScript knowledge. So that's the package.json file. Package log is related to that, and the Babel config.js file just configures how code is transpiled under the hood, and unless you know what you're doing, you also shouldn't change this file therefore. Now we do have the app.json file, which will become important later because here we can configure some settings and behaviors of our React Native app. And this is a file that will be picked up by Expo when our app is built for preview or for the actual app stores. We can set the name here, we can set some background colors here, and we will come back to this file occasionally for configuration. So this is a file which we have because we're using Expo. And then we got app.js. This is the only real code file we have in this starter project. The exact content could change over time. To make sure that we're all on the same page, I attached my app.js file to this lecture so that you can download it and replace yours with it so that you have the same code as I have it, because we'll build up on this code in the next lectures. This in here is a regular React component which uses special components, special JSX elements exposed by React Native. That's what I mentioned before. And then we got some styling which could look a bit weird, but I'll come back to how styling works in React Native apps later. So for the moment, this is our app code. And now it would be nice to see this code in action. For this, we need some device on which we can preview it. So we got our code opened up here. We created this project with Expo. Now it would be nice to preview our app. Because of course, whilst we're working on the React Native app, we want to constantly preview it so that we can see our changes and tweak the app as required. It would basically be nice to have the same kind of workflow or a comparable workflow as we have it with the browser and just React when we're building React web apps. There we can also create a React project and preview it in the browser. Now thankfully, since we're using Expo, previewing our app on a real device is super easy. You just need an Android device or an iPhone. In my case, I have an iPhone here, but the same is true for Android. And you visit the App Store there. And in the App Store, you can search for Expo. Now, you should find an Expo Go app. This is an app provided by the company behind the Expo CLI and this Expo package, which is part of our project here. So you can now download this app onto your device. This app is available for the iPhone and for Android devices. And once downloaded, you can open it. Now in here, you can preview your Expo apps that are built on your local computer. To do that, you should open up your terminal or command prompt. Here I'm using the one integrated into VS Code. You can open this by going to terminal here and opening a new terminal. And this is the default system terminal integrated here into VS Code. And then in here, you can run npm start. Now what this will do is it will actually start the Expo development server, which watches and builds our code and which builds our code basically such that we can preview it. And it also gives us a QR code here. You can scan this QR code with your Expo app on Android. Not on iOS, I'll come back to this in a second, but on Android, you will have a barcode scanner, a button that allows you to scan this barcode in your Expo Go app, which you downloaded. In addition, you also should have a browser tab that opened up where you also find this barcode and where you will find log messages printed by Expo as your app is running. Now on the iPhone, the scanner is not integrated into the Expo app. Instead, there you need to open your camera and then scan this barcode here or the one in the terminal. And then once you tap to open the link that is sent by that barcode, you should click Open, which opens the Expo Go app. Then you should grant any permissions the app might be asking for. And now you see here that the JavaScript bundle is being built. So the Expo app is being built. The React Native app based on Expo is built. And it opens up in this simulator on our real device here. So in this Expo Go app here. We can close this info screen. And now here we see our app, which we're building on our local machine running on a real device. Now we can tell that this is our app by changing this text. If I remove all the text here, and instead I say, hello world, the good old hello world message, and I then save this file, you will see that it basically instantly updates on your phone as well, in this Expo Go app, which we use for previewing. And this is how simple it is to build and test those Expo-based React Native apps with the Expo Go app, and why it's so recommended to use this Expo workflow. It simply makes building and testing React Native apps much easier. And this still is a React Native app here. We're just using Expo to make our life a bit easier. So this is how easy it is to get started with Expo and React Native. You can easily create an app, and with help of the Expo Go app, you can easily preview it. And you might not need more for now. You can now follow along and preview your app changes on your real device. But maybe you don't want to use your real device only. Maybe you also have an iPhone and you want to also preview the app on Android, but you don't have an Android device. For those reasons, you might want to install a simulator, which is an extra piece of software that runs on your local machine that simulates an iOS device or an Android device. Now for this, you can search for Android Studio to download Android Studio to get such a piece of software that allows you to run Android emulators on your local machine. On developer.android.com/studio, you will find a download link that allows you to download Android Studio for your operating system. And this can be downloaded for macOS and Windows. Now, the download can take a while, but make sure you do download and install it in order to be able to run emulators on your local device. Now for iOS, it's different. There you must open the App Store on macOS and search for Xcode and download this Xcode tool, which is Apple's developer environment for building iOS apps. Unfortunately, this is not available for Windows or Linux devices. So if you are on a Windows or Linux machine, you can't run iOS simulators through Xcode. This is a limitation applied by Apple. So unfortunately, on Windows or Linux, you can only build and test for Android. Actually, you will be able to build real iOS apps as well through some cloud build service, about which I'll talk a little bit later. But when it comes to previewing the app on an iPhone, if you don't own a real iPhone on which you can use the Expo Go app, or a macOS device on which you can install Xcode, you have to focus on Android instead. It is what it is. Now, once you did install Android Studio, you can open it and you should see a welcome screen that looks something like this, and that should have some more actions button. And in there you will find a virtual device manager. You can use this manager to build virtual devices, so to build emulators. So here I already have an emulator, but you can click on Create Device to build a new one, and here you can select from a broad variety of presets, like the Pixel 5, for example here. Click Next, then choose an Android version that will run on this emulator. And here I'll choose the API 32 version, which is the latest version in my case. Click Next, keep all the default settings here, and click Finish. And now this will create such a new emulator, and then you can click the play button to launch this emulator. And this will now launch this emulator on your device, so on your Windows or Mac OS or Linux device. I'll just increase it a little bit here. So that's now an Android phone, so to say, running on our computer. Of course, just a dummy phone, an emulator, but a real phone when it comes to testing Android apps. Now, I will show you how to run this app on this emulator in just a second. First, I want to show you how it would work for Xcode and macOS, which, as mentioned, only works on macOS. Here in Xcode, you want to open this as well. You don't have to open a project, you just need to open Xcode, and then you should go to the preferences there. In the preferences, make sure you go to locations, and here, under command line tools, make sure you have a version selected here. By default, no version is selected, and you should do that then. Select a version here. Once this is done, you can close it, and then we can go back here to our Expo app in VS Code. Now I used the terminal to run this npm start process, and this process is still running. You should, by the way, keep this process running as long as you are working on your code. If you quit this process, your code is not watched anymore, preview builds are not built anymore, and they are not pushed to your connected real devices or simulators anymore. You can always quit this process by pressing Ctrl+C, and you can then restart it by running npm start again. But as long as you're writing code, you should keep it running. Now in there, we had this QR code which we could scan to use the Expo Go app on a real device, but we can also press A to run it on Android or I to run it on iOS, and it will pick those running simulators or start a simulator for you. Nonetheless, it doesn't hurt to already start an Android simulator as I did it here, so that I can then press A, and now this is opening this on Android. So this app is now built and previewed on this Android emulator. Now in case you're getting an error like this, that is most likely related to the emulator you created. You might want to create a new emulator and make sure that you create one, or that you pick a template that has this Play Store icon. Because Expo needs to be able to access this Play Store, so the Play Store must be part of the emulator in order to download this Expo Go app, which is used for previewing, onto this emulator. So use an emulator template that has this icon, then still the latest version, all the defaults, and create this emulator and start that emulator. So now I'm launching a new emulator based on this new template here. And once this finished starting, we can again restart npm start maybe, and then press A again to find this emulator. It will be found automatically by Expo, and then it will install this Expo Go app onto this emulator and open our app there as well. We get this info screen, which we can close. We get this debug screen here, which we can use to reload the app, for example, or turn on certain debugging tools. But I will come back to debugging later. We can close this for now and see our app here. So that's Android. Now for iOS development, you should go to your applications and locate Xcode and show the package contents of that. Because in there in contents, developer applications, you will find this simulator app. And you can double click on this to start an iOS simulator. Now in this case, it's an iPhone 13 simulator. You can change this by clicking on it and going to the menu, and then under File Open Simulator, you can choose all kinds of devices, but I'll go with iPhone 13 here. We can also increase this in size to make that a bit easier to view. And now we can press I here. You don't even need to restart npm start. You can serve the preview on Android and iOS simultaneously. So I just served it on Android. Now I will press I to also start it on the iOS simulator, which also should be detected automatically. And now Expo will also install the Expo Go app on that simulator and open this app in that Expo Go app on our simulator. So here it's opening up, and after a short while, and it only takes that long initially when this is all first installed and set up, of course, after a short while, we will see our app preview on this device as well. Here we go, it's loading up now. And now we see Hello World here as well. So now we can preview our little application on a real device, as I showed it to you a couple of minutes ago, and on those simulators like this. And this process here should always stay up and running as long as you're writing code. So I will just make it smaller, and now we can change our code, add a couple of exclamation marks, and if we save this file, this is automatically picked up and reloaded on those apps without us doing anything. You can still manually reload it though by pressing R in this running terminal here. This will then manually reload those apps. And that's the development environment we will use for this course. This is now what we need to dive deeper into React Native and this course here. Now, that's it for React Native for now. Before we now really start diving into React Native and all its basics, let me briefly come back to this course and give you an overview of what you can expect from that course. Right now, we're just getting started, but we're pretty much done with that. And thereafter, we're going to dive into all the React Native essentials you need. In the next course section, we will dive into the basics, into how you can build user interfaces with React Native components, how you can style your user interfaces, how you can build powerful layouts, and of course, we're also going to practice all these things by building real apps. And thereafter, we're also going to learn how we can add navigation, how we can make sure that users can switch between different screens with nice animations, how you can add drawers or tabs and things like that. Now, this course also has a couple of prerequisites to make sure that you get the most out of all these concepts, out of all these sections, and specifically, you already need JavaScript and React.js knowledge. However, this course also comes with 2 refresher course sections, which you find at the end of this course, to which you can jump ahead if you want to go through those refreshers again before you start diving into all the React Native sections. These refreshers don't replace full courses on these topics, but they are great if it's been some time since you last worked with React, for example, and therefore it's my recommendation that you take a look at those refresher sections if you need them. Now, after all those React Native essentials, though, we're also going to dive into more advanced features, and specifically, we are going to learn how we can connect certain key React concepts with React Native. For example, how we can use the Context API or Redux with React Native. We're going to build a complete example app from the ground up to practice all these things we learned up to this point. We will learn how to handle user input and send HTTP requests, and all these things, again, by building multiple realistic apps. And we're also going to dive into more advanced course sections throughout this course. We're going to explore user authentication and how you could add that to an application. We're going to learn how you can tap into native device features, like using the device camera or the user's location. And we're also going to learn how we can prepare and build our apps for production, how you can get them ready for being published to the app stores. We're going to learn that in detail as well. Now, that's the course content. I also want to make sure that you get the most out of this course though. And the most obvious recommendation, of course, is that you should watch the videos because this is a video on demand course. But of course, watching the videos means that you should watch them at your own pace. You can use the video controls to speed the videos up or slow them down, and you should take advantage of that to make sure that you get the most out of them. You can also pause videos to practice something on your own, even if I don't tell you to practice something. Definitely do this on your own as well. And feel free to go back to the beginning of a video, to rewatch a video or even an entire section if something wasn't clear the first time you watched it, because that is the huge advantage of a video on demand course. So embrace that advantage. In addition, of course, in this course, we're going to build a lot of apps, we're going to write a lot of code, and I recommend that you do code along, that you don't just watch the videos, though you can, of course, also just do that, but you will learn more if you also pause the videos, if you practice things on your own, if you code along, if you try to write the code on your own, if you maybe even experiment with the code a little bit and you write slightly different apps, you add extra features that I might not add in the videos. Do all these things because that will ensure that you get even more out of this course. Now, when following along and when coding along, you will sometimes also get stuck. You might not be able to reproduce a certain result I'm showing in the videos, and for those cases, or if you want to, for example, get the course slides, you should use the course attachments that are also provided as part of this course. To be precise, in the next lecture after this one, you find a link to all the course resources, all the code snapshots and so on, and you should use these resources to compare your code to mine, to maybe even replace your code with mine or parts of your code with mine if you're stuck, to make sure that you can find plus fix your errors that you might be facing. The next lecture also contains instructions on how you can use the provided code resources, how you can download them, how you can use them to compare or replace your code. Now, last but not least, this course also has a Q&A section which you can use if you're stuck, if you have questions. But don't just use this section to ask questions. Instead, also try to help others. Because if you try to help others, if you reply to others, you will get way more out of this course, because when you solve someone else's problem, you are challenged to come up with a solution, to articulate that solution, and that will actually make sure that you really get the most out of this course, that you have to understand the things that I teach in this course, and that you fully understand them instead of just a little bit, for example. So definitely also use this Q&A section to help others and not just to ask for help. That's my recommendation for this course. And with all these recommendations, you will get a lot out of this course. You will learn React Native from the ground up in great detail, and therefore, in the next course section, it's now time to really dive into React Native in detail.